There are patients right now getting a drug that is not FDA approved. There was a blood safety crisis. It was a little bit more esoteric, and I really wanted to focus on making something happen. Then we were sort of off to the races and started raising money. This is your opportunity.
Welcome to The Dish, where we invite entrepreneurs to share their insights into the next generation of biotech companies. I'm Johannes Fruehauf, founder and CEO of LabCentral and Biolabs. After over a decade of working with entrepreneurs and supporting more than 1,200 startups, I'm here to bring you stories from our ecosystem. Are you ready to dish? Hello and welcome back to The Dish. My name is Johannes Fruehauf. I'm founder and CEO at LabCentral. And I'm here today with our guest, Elan Weiner, co-founder and CEO at ECI Therapeutics. Welcome.
Thanks.
To The Dish,
Thanks for
Elan.
having me. Pleasure to be here.
To get started, maybe you give our audience a 30-second elevator pitch of what is ECI?
Yeah, sure. ECI Therapeutics is a company that's focused on the development of drugs from human plasma used in wound healing. The first product that we're working on is for corneal damage, such as dry eye disease or other ocular surface disease. But we're also excited about being able to use these same growth factors that we're extracting from human plasma to help treat diabetic ulcers and other wounds.
Excellent. That was only 25 seconds. Thank you. We'll dig a little bit deeper into the company. But before we go there, tell us your story. What brings Elan to LabCentral?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure I knew that I was going to be here early on in my career. I have a background in blood banking and transfusion medicine. I'm a specialist in blood banking and have a clinical lab director's license. And I started my career in hospitals, both in New York and then in Florida. And when I was in Florida, transitioned to working in a community blood center. While I was there, it was really interesting to see how people were using substances like platelets as off-label drugs in very interesting ways, and it became something that I was interested in exploring further. And that really led me to look for roles that were more on the industry side, because frankly, at that moment in academia, I didn't see the type of science that was focused directly on drug development. It was a little bit more esoteric, and I really wanted to focus on making something happen. And that brought me to a company that at the time was called Fenwal and later was called Fresenius Kabi. Fresenius Kabi specializes in blood banking and transfusion medicine products, everything from devices to collect blood at blood centers through additive solutions to extend the life of platelets, which was the first product that I really worked extensively on. And that job really pivoted my career towards industry. I had a role there that was a combination of laboratory work associated with drug development, but also field and customer facing. So I was able to see how the drugs that we were developing were actually being used in community blood centers and at places where blood was being collected for transfusion. While I was working there, I took a little bit of a detour in my career because I became really interested in blood safety. I, early on in my career, had also gotten a master's in public health, and while I was doing that, was evaluating the nosocomial infection risks within hospital, meaning hospital-borne illness risks. And I had always found that to be very interesting. And when I had moved into blood banking, it became really clear that there's quite a bit of risk in blood transfusion. And I ended up moving to a company called Cerus, which is in the East Bay. And they focus on technologies for pathogen inactivation of blood, meaning how do you almost, because there's no technique that's foolproof, sterilize blood between the time when somebody donates it and it gets transfused into a patient.
I imagine that post-HIV and in Britain they have the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease.
Yep.
Those must have been even more important, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And actually, right in conjunction with the HIV crisis, there was a blood safety crisis associated with it. There were hepatitis and HIV patient populations, not just in transfusion medicine because they received transfusions, but in very large quantities of patients who receive drugs that are derived from plasma, meaning things like immunoglobulin therapy and hemophilia treatments. And within those patient groups, the prevalence was so high that actually just this past year, the United Kingdom came out and officially apologized for this having happened and said that they should have taken action sooner. Fast forward to today, and we're really making strides in improving the way that we handle blood safety. When you develop a drug from blood, you have to use two different pathogen inactivation techniques. When you make blood available for transfusion, you either have to do very rigorous bacterial testing and testing for certain viruses, or do a slightly smaller amount of those tests and this pathogen inactivation.
Let's talk a little bit about, before we go to ECI,
Yeah.
give our audience an overview of how transfusion products are used. And of course, there's whole blood replacement, but there's a whole industry of serum-derived therapies as well. Can you give us a quick overview?
Yeah, absolutely. And this sort of parlays well into what we were talking about before with my career, because one of the things that I was able to do at Cerus was to develop a business unit that was focused on manufacturing the company's first blood-based drugs. So when you collect blood, you can either use a device called an apheresis machine that collects a specific component of blood from a donor, meaning just their platelets or their plasma or their red cells, and returns to them the constituents that you're not collecting. And that's really working with the centrifuge inside of the device that separates the blood and allows you to collect just those parts. Or you collect a standard big bag of blood like you give at a blood drive near you. And when you do that, almost the same thing happens. It's just happening at the lab. They take that bag of blood and it goes into a centrifuge, and it's divided into platelets, sometimes plasma, and red cells. The way that it happens is through a series of sequential centrifugations that allow you to separate each of these into smaller segments, because that's really how care is provided these days in hospitals. It's more component therapy as opposed to whole blood therapy.
When do I need these products?
Yeah, I think if it's not exactly this statistic, it's close to it. I'm pretty sure that blood outside of things like ibuprofen and Tylenol is the most commonly prescribed drug in a hospital. At least it was before the pandemic. But the reality is it's used across a hospital. Platelets very frequently are used in oncology treatments. Bleeding disorders are treated with clotting factors that are derived from plasma. Individuals with disorders that impact their immune system oftentimes receive other drugs. And then around the hospital, patients are all the time receiving red cells and plasma transfusions just based on particular lab results.
In our pre-discussion, you mentioned how at Cerus that leadership gave you an opportunity to develop your own product, and how that may have positioned you well to be ready to be a CEO of a blood-derived company now. Can you tell us a little bit the background of that experience?
Yeah, sure. I was really fortunate to have some really exceptional leaders of the organization who became and are very important mentors to me. The Chief Operating Officer of Vivek Jayaraman and the CEO, Obi Greenman, who were successively my bosses in the company, gave me this opportunity after working there for about 5 years to take an idea that a small group of us had to make a drug from human plasma that could be used in bleeding control and actually develop that. And Cerus, prior to that, had no therapeutics business unit. There was only the medical device side of the company. And so this was really a nascent idea and a nascent project that we were developing from scratch. So it started with research and development, building a quality regulatory infrastructure for the product, going through all of the steps of having the product FDA approved, setting up a supply chain because it's a frozen product until it's thawed at the hospital, all to bring this product to a hospital that is really important to bleeding control.
Tell us, is the product still in the market? Do patients receive this now?
Yeah, in fact, it's growing in utilization. The product is used The indication of it is for the control of bleeding associated with trauma, cardiovascular surgery, and obstetrical hemorrhage. It's actually termed acquired bleeding as opposed to a bleeding disorder.
Yep.
And within this space, there really is only one other product that had that indication up until just a couple of weeks ago when there was another that got approved. But there was only one that had this indication, and the problem with it was you needed to keep it frozen right up until the moment you used it. Otherwise, the proteins would not necessarily be efficacious enough, and there was also a bacterial risk. So we said that is a good product, but the practical implications of how you have to store this make it really difficult to use. And so that's what we corrected for, using the pathogen inactivation technology that the company had already developed. We figured out how we could collect these proteins and stabilize them so that you can have factor 8 von Willebrand's factor, factor 13, this milieu that's involved in hemostasis, available thawed in a blood bank for as soon as that patient rolls into the emergency department heavily bleeding.
Where is that product available now? Is it all over the US?
Yeah, it is. It's available around the United States. The number of hospitals that are switching to it is at a pretty sharp incline. I don't have a day-to-day involvement with that anymore, but just from recent conversation with my former colleagues and my former boss at Cerus, they're really excited about the growth trajectory of the product, and it's becoming a much larger part of their portfolio. And and that was really the first opportunity that I had to develop a drug, and now it's really amazing to see it on the market and to hope that it's helping people. Yeah.
That must make you very proud. Congratulations. That's great.
Thanks. Yeah, it was an amazing team, and I was really fortunate to get to be general manager of that therapeutics business, but I think I may have had a role that was only as good as the team that we had around me. So yeah, I was really lucky.
So there are many questions that derive from your comment there, but we do want to go back to ECI.
Yeah.
Tell us the origin story of ECI. It's not that you founded it by yourself. You have a co-founder and now a team. How did you come to find your co-founder in ECI?
Yeah, this is a pretty interesting story. When I was at Cerus, was also responsible for business development, and I was sort of keeping my finger on the pulse of drugs that were being made from human plasma. And there were a couple of companies that were looking into developing a plasma or serum-derived eye drop for the treatment of dry eye disease. And I was evaluating the couple of companies that were doing that, and through those evaluations, was connected with somebody that is now my business partner, and he's an ophthalmic surgeon in New York City, Ron Gentili. And he had been really passionate about developing a product like this. His background is in retina surgery, which is the back of the eye, not the front of the eye. But because he had so many patients who were diabetics and had corneal disease as a result, or had diabetic retinopathies, and you have to cut through the cornea to help treat some of those, and then the wound healing process is so slow that he had been really reliant on a plasma or serum-derived eye drops for those patients. And he was able to get it until he wasn't. The product had never actually been FDA approved, and it was being made in the back of doctors' offices in a way that was not covered by insurance and didn't have sterile practices around it. And so the hospital that he was working with was made to stop making it. And this really turned him on to the idea of how do you make a pharmaceutical grade product. And one of the things that he had noticed was that the other problem is the mucoadhesiveness of this product. These growth factors don't stay on the mucosal membrane of the eye as well as he would have liked. So he started working on a molecule, a polysaccharide, to help these growth factors stick on the eye, and then kind of stopped because he didn't know how to manufacture the drug. And when we reconnected, it turns out that he, about 5 years earlier, had reached out to Cerus and things never went anywhere, but times had changed and we had moved on, and I became pretty excited about the prospect of partnering with him because I had spent some time thinking about how you can actually develop a scalable manufacturing process. And so I was looking into how these two pieces could come together when my former boss said to me, this is your opportunity. You have to figure out how to team up with him and make this into a company. We will support you, and we will make sure that you have access to the pathogen inactivation technology necessary to make a product like this. And then we were sort of off to the races and started raising money.
It's so interesting to hear that you are now formalizing a process that the physicians did themselves as a process, not really as a product, but like sort of as a way of treating patients, right? And you're distilling that into a real product.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So one of the things that I think is great about our product is that we know that the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, which is this pool of a multitude of growth factors, is very effective in wound healing, especially on the ocular surface for dry eye disease, ocular surface disease in general, and we believe also for ocular burns, and also on the rest of the body. But because there have been many studies done, but it's been using patients' own growth factors derived from their own plasma. And so we had the idea of how do we take those APIs out of, if you will, donated plasma that's pooled from hundreds or maybe even thousands of donors in a way that's safe and efficacious and consistent. And how do we bring that in front of the FDA in a way that they will be comfortable with it? And that's really what the path we started down.
How far are you in the development of this process now?
So this process starts at a blood center with somebody coming in and donating their plasma or their blood, and then the plasma gets separated out from it. A lot of that plasma goes to hospitals for transfusion, but some of it goes to the development of drugs. And so we have a supply chain that starts with plasma partners, and from there, we started the development process of how do we actually extract from this plasma these growth factors, and how do we pool it together, and how do we pathogen inactivate it in a way that'll meet the guidelines that we think exist, but also there are in some areas no guidelines yet. And so we've started the work of, or rather we started with the work of figuring out the extraction process. What is the most effective way to, from human plasma, concentrate down the growth factors that we want while removing those larger proteins like factor VIII and von Willebrand's factor and fibrinogen, while maintaining the smaller ones in the product. And we came up with a pretty interesting process that leverages some of it is filtration, and some of it is a couple of other processes. And what we're left with is a highly concentrated milieu of these growth factors that are involved in wound healing. And then we can reconstitute them in another solution. We have, through this process, removed the anti-A and anti-B antibodies, meaning the blood type of the donor and the patient don't need to be the same. And we've received the plasma having already been pathogen inactivated with Cerus's system. And then we do a second pathogen inactivation step on it using a nanofiltration method. And this is because the FDA requirements for other plasma-derived drugs are that you have to have two distinct methods that use two different mechanisms of action and achieve a very high log reduction in pretty much every pathogen of concern. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that regulatory side of things. You describe how you have now solved for the sourcing and then the manufacturing of your product, but you still can't just treat patients, right? You need to get permission from the FDA. Ultimately, you need to get to an approval.
Yeah.
Do you actually have to go through clinical trials for this?
Yeah, we do.
Talk to us about which agency are you going through,
Sure.
and how is that interaction going for you?
Yeah, because this is an eye drop and all other treatments that are approved on the market for dry eye disease go through CDER, which is the drug portion of the FDA, but this is made from a biological material. This type of eye drop, this type of product, an eye drop, is very new to CBER. And so we got on the phone with them pretty early on. We were able to have this interact meeting and proposed to them at this meeting a development process, a method for pathogen inactivation, how we were going to prove the product was ABO universal. And we requested that because there is ample safety data on human plasma, we be allowed to bypass a phase 1 clinical trial and go directly to phase 2. To jump to the punchline, they said yes to the last point. So we are able to bypass that phase 1, and we're in the process right now of planning for that phase 2.
So for startups, time is such a precious resource.
Yeah.
Can you describe what lies ahead for your team and for yourself at ECI in the next 6 and 12 and maybe 24 months?
Yeah, sure. So on the short-term horizon, we are about to start pharmacokinetics and toxicology testing. We have a CRO that we're working with for those because that's not something that we're able to do in-house. But in parallel to those happening, we have a number of other CMC, chemistry, manufacturing, and control activities that need to happen. Because we're not just developing a drug, we also need to develop the eyedropper that's going to keep this drug sterile for the entire shelf life of the product, including when it's in a patient's hands. So we have the sterility and stability work that we're doing on the drug substance itself, but then we have all of these other stages where we have to be able to prove the same thing. So we have a lot of those work that it's queuing up right now. And we also are doing a lot of work to help us identify which of those viscosifying agents is going to be the most effective, not just for dry eye disease, but for some of the subsequent products that we'd like to make.
What are some of the other indications that you think the same product could be applied to?
I think that in all likelihood, the product that we're developing right now is going to have a ocular surface disease indication of some sort. I think dry eye disease. My suspicion is that when we develop a product for ophthalmic burns, which I think that this will be very effective in that space where there actually is no product that has that indication right now, I think we're going to try to increase the concentration of growth factor. So the same constituent products, the same constituents of the product, but just in a higher level of growth factor, and we'll work hard to remove even more of the fibrinogen from it. Because in a burn situation, you want the burn to heal without clots forming, which causes scar tissue. Exactly.
Would you think of non-ophthalmic indications as well?
Yeah, from a non-ophthalmic perspective, we've been pretty heavily focused on we've been pretty heavily focused on the ophthalmic indications up to date, but we're excited about things like diabetic ulcers and hard to heal wounds when we start looking around the rest of the body. Because, in areas of poor circulation, one of the things that you really miss in the wound healing process are these growth factors that actually prompt the reproduction of the cells necessary, not just to heal, but also for the vasculature to return to the area.
Yeah. When will this first be given to patients?
So I think we're about 18 months away from our phase 2 kicking off. The time horizon on that, obviously, one of the things that can shift that pretty dramatically is the pre-IND meeting that we're going to have coming up in the first part of next year. But I think because we had that interact meeting, we're very well aligned with the agency, with the FDA. And I think that from a certain perspective, going to the FDA and saying, look, there are patients right now getting a drug that is not FDA approved and being made in the back of doctors' offices in a non-sterile manner, and we're coming to you to ask for your help in figuring out the right way to get a drug approved, is a really nice way to approach the agency, because they are looking to make drugs safer without impacting availability. And I think that this accomplishes both.
Very good. Let's switch topics a little bit. and talk about the harsh realities that many startups face, which is funding.
Yeah.
And the macro environment has not been friendly for many of our startups at LabCentral.
Yeah.
To the extent you feel comfortable talking about it, tell us, how have you fundraised for ECI and what lies ahead?
So to date, we've raised $5 million, and we did that through two $2.5 million convertible notes. The first one was at the very beginning of the project, and the second one was towards the beginning of this year. Those initial dollars were spent on the research and development that I think is absolutely required from a regulatory perspective, but we've also spent some of our time and energy focused on studies that we think will be necessary for investors in order for them to want to put in larger sums of money. We're queuing up now a Series A at the $21.5 million mark. And we've been talking to funds that have a very specific focus on ophthalmology and hematology. In particular, certainly we're non-discriminant in terms of other funds, but this is an interesting intersectional product in that you have both of those types of groups that could be interested, and companies from both of those spaces that could be interested.
Who would be a buyer for ECI? What types of companies would be interested in the product?
Yeah, there's a couple of companies that have a very large portfolio of plasma-derived drugs, and those are interesting for us to think about talking to. And there are also companies that have a very specific focus in ophthalmology. And I recently had the opportunity to have the conversation with the CEO of one of them, and he was excited about the product. He said, "This is a really interesting product. Get further along in your process, because I don't know, we don't have as a company the knowledge and skill to develop a biologic. But when you get further down your process of development and you have a fully scaled up manufacturing process, et cetera, come talk to me again." And so that gives me some level of hope and excitement that there's going to be a number of different types of organizations that will at least think about this product.
Thank you for that overview of ECI. Since you are a LabCentral company, tell us about your experience at LabCentral. Are you getting to know other startups? Are you interacting with other founders here? Is this helpful for your network?
LabCentral, I think, is a really interesting place to be if you're a small company, because it's not only a infrastructure of equipment that you wouldn't have access to if you were working on your own. There's millions and millions of dollars of equipment in this facility that small companies like mine need access to in limited amounts, but we could never afford on our own. The way that we leverage the equipment here is only a part, though, of how we leverage LabCentral. There's an exceptionally good network of other CEOs that you can get advice from, you can get referrals for different service providers from, and you also just have the opportunity to talk to people about what you're doing, get advice, see how they've gone about fundraising, and make these really important connections. Beyond that, I'm excited to work with you guys because I know that the fundraising network that LabCentral has is also very robust. And just coincidentally, through just casual conversations with members of your team, I actually hired 2 employees through referrals. Yeah,
that's great. That's great to hear. So the network is actually working for you.
Yeah, definitely.
That's great. We also asked you, because we love the color orange, as you have noticed. We asked you to bring an orange object, and you brought 2.
I did. I brought 2. Overachiever.
What are these 2 orange objects, and what meaning do they have for you?
Yeah. So this one in the front here is representative of plasma. It's from a company, I guess I'll give them a shout out, called Giant Microbes.
Okay.
And my friend and former colleague gave this to me when my first plasma-derived product was FDA approved, so that bleeding control product.
That's an awesome recognition.
Yeah, it's really lovely. And all of the glass awards and things like that you get across your career have whatever meaning you attach to it, and then you get something like this, and you're like, this is what really matters.
And you have a second product, the orange object. What is that?
This is just my espresso cup that I use on a daily basis because I think, like you, Johannes, I run on caffeine and
don't we all?
And I'm a little bit of a coffee connoisseur. Yeah.
Very good. Well, Elan, it's been fun talking to you.
Yeah,
thank you so much for doing this, and thank you to our audience and to the team for putting this up, and we'll see what comes of it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Pleasure.